Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Son of a Blitch podcast. I'm your host, George Blitch, and I just wrapped up a wonderful conversation with Patrick Durkin. For those who aren't aware, he has been a lifelong outdoor writer. He is a frequent contributor over at the MeatEater website at themeateater.com. Just search his name. You'll see all those articles. You can also go check out patrickdurkinoutdoors.com, which he features his weekly and biweekly newspaper articles there, his submissions. He shares those as well. So there's a ton of different articles that he's been a part of. You can go check out. Today, we kind of talk about that history, how that started, how he kind of got involved in becoming a writer and then working with newspapers and then outdoor magazines and then, eventually now, teaming up on Meat Eater contributions. But we really kind of covered a lot of other things in his life too. His time in the Navy a little bit. We talked a little bit about the trip back to Normandy where they had their 80th anniversary of D-Day. We talked a lot about that and just a lot of life philosophy lessons, things that were important to him. We really covered a lot of ground today, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy this conversation. Patrick's just a wonderful guy, and it was really an honor and a privilege to sit down and chat with him. So I hope you guys will tune in. Make sure you check out all the show notes below because there's a lot of links so you can go and follow his writings and his career and a lot of other things we kind of talked about and touched on today. So without further ado, here's the podcast with Patrick Durkin. Y'all enjoy. Hey, Pat, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I really appreciate this chance to talk to you, George.
Oh man, I'm excited too. I know we've kind of been chatting about this here for months, and it's really great to sit down with you. And there's so many questions I want to ask. I kind of just figured for people who may not be familiar with your work, with your writing, with your history, maybe we can go ahead and go back to talking about where you were born and raised. Maybe, some of the mentors kind of got you into the outdoor space and the writing space. And, then I want to talk about, your Navy career and obviously your illustrious writing career, working with Meat Eater. And there's so many things that we'll thread throughout there. But I kind of just figured give a little bit of a foundation on kind of, where you come from, and we'll kind of go from there.
Well, thanks, George. Yeah, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and I lived on the far west side of town. And one thing I really didn't realize at the time that I was lucky in that era was I could walk out the back door of my parents' house, cross a railroad track nearby, and walk down to the Lake Mendota. It was about a mile-long walk. And then I would carry a little backpack and a fishing rod and that kind of stuff, and a rubber raft on my shoulder. And I could go out fishing. And I used to fish from the shore down there. And then when I got to be early teens, I bought this rubber raft from Army Navy store and got into that. Also on that railroad track, in that era, this is back in the 1960s. That railroad track was pretty much the far west side of Madison. And since then, the city's grown up quite a bit of, like 2 to 3 miles beyond there. But in that era, I could still take my bow and arrow and hunt that railroad track pretty effectively. And you couldn't shoot like a 22 or something, but you could shoot a bow and arrow and nobody would bother you. And pellet rifles, I tended to avoid those because the police would see that and think you're going to be shooting. In that era, we still had telephone poles with these glass things up on, I don't know what to call them, but
Yeah, like the ceramic conduits and stuff.
like that, and they get shot out by kids. And so I just learned to not, if the cops didn't care about you shooting a bow and arrow, but anytime they saw a gun, they would stop and ask you what you're up to. So anyway, that was my background as a little kid. And so I was able to go hunting and fishing right from my backyard, back in the 1960s, early 70s. And I used to, in that era too, it was kind of fun to think about how I could ride my bicycle out 5 miles and be deer hunting. And, I could carry my shotgun. In that era, Wisconsin required you to carry your gun in the case. So I just put the shotgun in the case and tied to my handle, tied to the bar in my bicycle and go riding out. And same with the bow and arrow. I was shooting a recurve back then because we didn't have compounds when I first started hunting. So I really, I was one of four boys in my family, and I was the only one that really had that real strong desire for hunting and fishing. One of my brothers still fishes, but the other two don't do either. My dad was kind of a casual hunter, but he's an excellent shot. So I got a little coaching from him on how to shoot a rifle. He wasn't into bows, and his dad was more of a hunter than he was. So it's just I always find that kind of interesting how families, kids find their way, what interests them, and that's why I could talk about this recruitment stuff, hunting all day, because it's so unpredictable how we get young people into hunting and fishing. And in my case, my dad was not worried about creating the next generation of hunters. Just that's kind of a modern thing that we worry about in that era. If you hunted or fished, that, that wasn't just that wasn't they weren't worrying about the long term hunting population back then. So that's my background. I was basically a bluegill and perch fisherman as a kid. Crappies when they'd be on the shores, and then small game. But by age of 15, I was getting serious about bow hunting, and then I killed my first deer as a teenager with a recurve when I was 17, I think. And then I just over the years, I just I kind of found my way to where eventually in my career deer hunting became the primary thing, and to this day is still kind of my primary focus in my work. But back then I didn't really have any clear aspirations of where it would all go as far as writing and that kind of thing.
Well, how did that writing start? Is it something that you were writing as a kid and then eventually that's something you kind of decided as a vocation you wanted to move into that? Was it always outdoor related? Kind of give me that idea of like how that kind of turned into beginning to pivot into that career that you've had, for all these years and kind of how that began.
Yeah, I think I was the last person around me who really realized that was my one strength, something I could make a career out of. When I went into the Navy at age 19, I wasn't quite 20. I was maybe a year and a half out of high school. And when I went into the Navy, my goal was to become a firefighter. My grandfather and my father were both massive firefighters. My dad actually was fire chief by the time I got out of the Navy. So I really had an in, if I had wanted to pursue that career. But my dad had this good advice about I should finish off, go back to college, get my degree in journalism, and then if I still wanted to be a firefighter, he'd always say it'd be a great part-time job for a firefighter. When you're not on duty, you could work on freelancing. But by the time I got out of college, after the Navy, I spent 5 years in the Navy. Um, I should say the Navy made a lot of things possible for me, and it helped me realize where my strengths were. Because I wanted to go into firefighting, the Navy trained me in damage control. I was, they didn't call it damage controlman, but that's basically what I was trained in. Though was how to quickly patch holes, whatever pipes break, whatever it might be. So I learned how to weld. I learned how to all the different forms of welding, whether it's with arc welding or gas welding, sheet metal work, pipe fitting, and there's just a lot of good trade skills I learned in the Navy. At the same time, though, I was writing home a lot to friends and family, and over those years, those 5 years, it was interesting how many people started telling me, when you get out, you should go into journalism or go into some kind of writing career because they really liked the way I was writing my letters. And in fact, I even bought a manual typewriter back then because of the ship I was on. I could sit, and bang away on a typewriter much faster than I could handwriting letters. So that's what I did. And so by the time I came out, I kind of had this idea that maybe I should at least explore journalism and then see where it takes me. And the next thing you know, I ended up in a career in journalism. I started off at a newspaper in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, worked there for 8 years, and never did get into firefighting. And I've often, when my dad was still alive, I told him a couple of times, Dad, if I'd listened to you, I could have been retired by now. Just here I am at age 68, I'm still cranking away, and I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that's just the way life, unfolds sometimes. And you get into something like what's really your passion. And obviously, writing and reporting was something I got real passionate about, and editing and those different skills. And so the thing I take away from it too, though, George, is that one thing I really liked about the Navy was by working these trade skills the Navy taught me to function effectively on a ship. I started to realize that I wasn't as good as some of the other guys around me in those skills. And those guys, I think, probably got out and put those skills to work out in the marketplace, whether they worked in shipyards or wherever it might be. They probably did pretty well for themselves. One guy I know ran his own hardware store in Dallas, Texas for all of his career. He retired after he sold out his business a few years ago. So he'll tease me about how he benefited from the Navy's training. And look at him. He made it, did pretty well for himself, and retired long before I ever will. so so those kind of things always come to mind for me, and what a good experience it was for me.
So when you did that 8 years at the newspaper, I mean, I know since then there's been a lot that we can cover too. You've worked obviously as a journalist in many facets, and now today you're a contributor, MeatEater. You got your weekly columns that you're still doing now, and you've done editorial services and other things too. So kind of walk me through after you did that 8 years there. And while you were there, was there a particular thing that were you doing outdoor writing then, or was this something that because I know, we talked a little bit about the sign behind you there and basketball and doing some things there. I'd love for you to share that if you care to, but it seems like you had done a lot of writing in a different, many different categories. So I was kind of curious how you eventually chopped into have that be your focus in kind of that outdoor lifestyle.
Sure. That's another one of those little career journeys I love talking about. And when people today, I get quite a few inquiries from young people wanting to get into the outdoor writing as a career. The thing I'll always tell them is that the path I took was a very probably not uncommon path, 40 years ago. Today, I really wouldn't know where to start other than to say you just start digging. You start working, and you shouldn't expect to get where I've gotten to be overnight, because I certainly didn't get here overnight. It was a long process, and you got to work your tail off every step of the way. But to answer your question more directly, I spent 8 years at the newspaper in Oshkosh, and the fun part about that, I think, was that by the time I was halfway through college, I was working part time for the newspaper in town, covering high school sports, covering college sports, wherever they need me. I even covered a few Green Bay Packer games, because we were only about an hour south of Green Bay, the newspaper I was at. So they would send me up to Green Bay once in a while to do. They'd give me an assignment and see how I do. But the thing that I kept kind of pounding at, I knew enough about the newspaper industry back then to realize that the outdoor page, where I really ultimately wanted to end up, there weren't many full-time jobs in Wisconsin for full-time outdoor writers, but there were a couple. And to get there, though, you had to build your foundation. So I knew that most newspapers had an outdoor page, and Oshkosh had an outdoor page. So I kind of wanted to work my way in to get control of that page, because no one really was putting a whole lot of effort into it. And so after about 6 months on the job, I started this kind of trying to make a point of writing at least one outdoor article a week, giving it to the editor who handled that page. And eventually they kind of asked me, well, do you just want to take over that page? And of course, that's what I wanted. But of course, I couldn't do it full time. They would still have me working on, I worked 2 years on the sports department, because one thing I should have said was that the outdoor page was controlled by the sports editor. And so the sports editor, I figured, well, I'll start as a sports reporter, cut my teeth there. And even though my only real interests in sports were the Packers and the University of Wisconsin Badger hockey team, I knew enough about football and hockey to get to function as a reporter. And then I learned my shortcomings where even though I played baseball and stuff, I didn't really know about how to do box scores and all the things you learn on the job as a sports reporter. So I did a lot of, I'd say, real hardcore sports reporting where, you sit there and watch a game, go down the locker room, interview the coach, interview the players, run back and crank out a story and then file it, and writing on deadline for newspapers is great training. And unfortunately, that's kind of an avenue that most people don't have today. Having to do things quickly and efficiently and not having an abundance of mistakes. It really is it was a tough way to make a living. You see why people in this newspaper industry were notorious being heavy drinkers and heavy smokers. It wasn't an easy way to make a living, but they did it, and so I did that for a couple of years, and then I started kind of branching out. And when I got control of the outdoor page, I became a regular beat reporter for the Wisconsin Oshkosh school system. I covered the Oshkosh school boards and the high schools, and spent a lot of time on covering the nuts and bolts of a school board and school budgets, and learning how teacher unions negotiate, things. And it was good training. It was really excellent where you really dig into union contracts and how teachers negotiate, how school boards negotiate, and how they juggle all these things. And then I did that for another couple of years. And then eventually, after about 4 years in the newspaper, they promoted me to be weekend editor, where I was in charge of the weekend newspapers. And I was still doing the outdoors beat though the whole time. And along the way, George, I used to interview a guy for some of my local outdoor stories named Al Hofacker. And Al was one of the original founders and creators of a magazine called Deer and Deer Hunting magazine. And they started in 1977 in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is only about 25 miles up the road from Oshkosh. So I got to know Al. And he was just a real good local conservationist guy who was, he not only ran the magazine, but was real involved in the politics of deer management, wildlife management in Wisconsin, and really engaged. So I learned a lot from him. And one day, about 8 years into my newspaper career, they contacted me at the magazine, asked me if I was ever interested in switching over into magazine work. And I have to say, I really wasn't into it. I was on a newspaper track. I loved newspaper work. My goal was to become the outdoor editor at the Milwaukee Journal, which was then just the Milwaukee Journal, and later it became the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And this is where you started to realize, even though it's much easier to see in hindsight, that the media industry was changing. Mm-hmm. Newspapers were fading. Newspapers started consolidating. Magazines were still doing pretty good, but I didn't really realize till like 20 years into my career, basically, that I was riding this wave of dying media. As newspapers were starting to fade, I was stepping off into magazines. And about the time I left the magazine in 2001, left Deer and Deer Hunting in 2001, well, the magazine industry was collapsing too. And these days, I'm still writing my weekly newspaper column. I still sell it to about 7 or 8 newspapers here in Wisconsin. But over the years, I lost some of my biggest newspaper clients. They just, they consolidated. And one of my stories to kind of move things along here is I remember I met Steve Rinella in 2010. Doug Durkin introduced me to Steve during a hunt down at his farm. First time he met Steve too. Steve came down with a hunt, and Doug had invited him after reading his book, American Buffalo. So this is like 2010. But I'd been freelancing. I started freelancing full time in 2001. And so I was cobbling together different sources of income. And I found I was pretty good at it. It really, freelancing worked out great for me because I was always, I never needed someone to tell me to go to work. I was always pretty self-motivated. And I always had this I knew enough about freelancing by the time I started doing it 20 years into my career that you have to write and edit as if there's a gun to your head. That if you're not constantly cranking, finding new outlets for your work, and then also not doing it for free or for a bad price, you have to really insist on being paid and paid a fair wage. I'm still not great at that, but I think I could be making more probably than I am. But I think I'm not a great negotiator either. But I am a hard worker. So anyway, the reason I mentioned Steve at that point was one of my stories that I've shared, started sharing more openly, is that in 2018, this is like Steve. I think he started MeatEater around 2012 or so, right in that era. And then he started his podcast in 2015. I think he had the Netflix TV show going by then. But we had stayed in touch, he would call once in a while when he was working at articles, and I'd share information on who to contact here or there. Um, it was a good mutual respect type of relationship where if I needed help, I knew I could call him for advice on something, and if he needed help, same thing. But when Steve got that podcast rolling, and then next thing you know, he's got this whole big thing taking off. I remember in 2018, Doug and I were in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and Steve was in town to be the keynote speaker at a Leopold event, a Leopold event down there. I think it was at the local college there in La Crosse. The conservation type group had brought him in. So while he's in town, Giannis Tellis was his producer back then for the podcast, asked if we'd be available to do a couple of podcasts. So of course, I'll always say no one says no to Steve Rinella. And what was kind of fun about that, it ended up being we recorded the podcast in the morning, and then they said, "Well, you got time to do one in the afternoon?" So I said, "Of course, yes." And after lunch, just getting ready to start recording another podcast, and Steve told Giannis to wait a second. Then he asked me if he said, "Hey, I'm going to be starting on expanding MeatEater here over the next few months, and would you be interested in doing some regular writing for us?" And of course, at the time, George, I really didn't need extra work. I was really busy beyond belief already,
Sure.
commitments. But I had the sense to realize you don't say no to Steve Rinella. He offers you something, you make room for it. And so I did. So I almost instantly said, of course, when do I start, basically? And I think within a couple of weeks, then we got together and figured out how often I could write for him and what kind of work I'd be doing. And then different editors came and went the first couple of years at MeatEater. And within 2 years, though, by the time Spencer Newhart became the editor, online editor for MeatEater, I think Spencer came in like maybe 6 months into my first few articles for MeatEater, and I started hitting it off with Spencer, and then we kind of settled on a format for my work where it'd be a longer version of articles. I think I started off writing 1,000-word articles, and then after a while, we started realizing, well, some of these topics I'm tackling really they just can't be done in that short of space. Based on newspaper format, they need to be expanded into more of a magazine, long form articles. So with Spencer's help, I started doing that, and that's kind of where I've been ever since. These days, Maggie Hudlow is now my editor at MeatEater, and it's I really believe in this idea that when it comes to work, that you give it your best shot every day. That you can't mail it in some days and just hope that that will get you by. That I really believe in the idea that you make your best effort every day when you sit down, and that's how you stay in business. And I keep little motivational things on my, not, you can't see it from here, but around me, I have little motivational quotes from people that help, keep me inspired. Basically, one of them is a Vince Lombardi quote where he, let's see here. This is a Vince Lombardi.
Uh-huh.
Perfection is unattainable. Excuse me again. Perfection is unattainable because we're human, but in striving for perfection, we'll achieve excellence. And I always think that's a powerful way to look at the world, that you can't be perfect, but you can strive for that perfection. And that in the process, maybe you'll get to be where your work is excellent. And I think and he had another great line about work being something where you should always do the best, because it's not an every now and then thing; it's an every time. And I think people who play sports at a high level, I'm not an athlete, but I can relate to the guys who say things like, I read once Mike Holmgren talked about how when you coach quarterbacks, you coach them to hit something like this big, about the size of the opening in your hands, and that you try to hit that 30 yards down the field. And if you start settling for less than that, well, the ball starts wandering around. And I think hunters know exactly what he's talking about. That you aim small, you miss small. And
Yep.
I think in hunting and writing, all these things, that they all have the same, I think, level of devotion and attention to detail that you can respect in others. And that I've always said, I knew at an early time in life I'd never be the Brett Favre of the world. This before Brett Favre, of course. But you
Right.
start realizing, in my era, it was Sandy Koufax. This great loss of the LA Dodger pitcher. He was left-handed, and I'm left-handed, so I thought he was my hero as a boy. But then as you get older, you start realizing that there's only so many Sandy Koufaxes in this world, but you still, though, as you get older, you start respecting those guys that they have natural talent, but they also work at it. It doesn't just happen by accident. All these guys work at it, and the longer I lived, the more I hung around people who really work hard and work at their craft. You realize, they have exceptional talent, but they're also very motivated people. And I really believe that. I just don't believe anyone can get by mailing it in. And to kind of continue that thought in the deer hunting world, one thing I loved about working at Deer and Deer Hunting magazine was that I got to meet deer hunters who were just exceptional deer hunters. They weren't, there's so much stupid jealousy among hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I have seen it. Everyone listening to this, watching this, probably knows people who worry way too much about what other people are doing. And there's people out there who cut corners and break the law and do stupid things to get a big buck. I mean, we've all read the articles about those who do. But I also know people that I cross paths with who are just excellent deer hunters. Whether it's Jim Shockey, whether it's Greg Miller up here in Wisconsin. I could go down the list of many deer hunters I met over the years who I started to realize I love deer hunting. I'm not in that category, of guys who really, they have certain talents, certain instincts, certain observational skills that I lack, but I respect. And I don't spend a whole lot of time being jealous of other people's deer or other people's big fish, whatever it might be. I just think, well, I like to think I'm good at what I do, and I try not to be boastful about it, but I like to think I'm good at what I do. But I also realize it's not something that would happen if I weren't such a hard worker. I believe in the idea of working so hard that when opportunity knocks, that you're there at the door, ready to take advantage of it, and that people will eventually recognize you if you're out there every day cranking away. Eventually, someone looks over and notices you, as being that guy who they can count on to deliver for them. And so I can, that's kind of the approach I've taken all through my career. And I never really lacked that motivation, and so I think that's what carried me was that I should, I'll shut up and let you ask your question. But the other thing I wanted to, before I forget, I think I have a little philosophy, George, that goes something like a little insecurity is not a bad thing. If you have a little insecurity in our lives about who we are, how good we are, whatever it might be, that keeps us motivated. The people who don't have that insecurity, I think, when they start thinking that they're just really good and they can mail it in, I think it'll catch up with you. If you think that you're so good that you don't need to do your homework and do your practice, all the kind of things that make people exceptional, it will catch up with you. There's very few people who can just get by on talent alone. So,
No,
oh,
those are really great points. And I thought of a few things. One, it's like, you see someone's success and people are like, wow, they're an overnight success. Yeah, it only took 40 years. Like the idea of how much work people put into things, the things you don't see, you just kind of see the top of the mountain. You don't think about all the foundational times to put in that. And I think about like the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours and when you mentioned the insecurity there, like I think it's good to have insecurity too. I don't think you necessarily have to have it in the driver's seat or the passenger seat, but you can put it in the trunk and have it be a part of your vehicle. Because there's a book I read, The War of Art, which kind of talks about this idea of, that inner voice that's always the negative thing that oh, this isn't good enough, or I don't know. Like you have to tackle that, and you have to meet it, and you have to have a relationship with that own self, doubt or reflection to really be able to, I think, sometimes get over that and move forward. But it's going to be a part of things. And there's a lot of folks like, man, I'm not as good as Brett Favre. I'm not going to go out for quarterback. Well, yeah, he wasn't ever that great at the very beginning. Like anything that you do, if as your writing career, right? And anything that people will get into as a career, I think it's the time you put into it, it's the discipline, it's the hard work, and I think you keyed in on it, the idea of wanting to produce the best at whatever you're doing, no matter what it is across the board. When you have that kind of tenacity and focus towards that and that drive, and like you said too, like the hardest thing what they say is like the pen on the paper, button the seat. Like writing, you just have to do it, and it has to be a discipline. Like the more you create things and you work on them, the better you're going to get over time. And if you find out that welding might not be the strongest suit, and let your buddy do that, you can find your direction. But if you don't try those things out, I think people get discouraged or they get lost, especially people that are coming in like, what do I do with my career? Do I go to college? Like it's a big thing. Like I kind of went through a bunch of motions and tried a bunch of different things. I've worn so many different hats over my different various careers. You wouldn't think one connected to the other, but that hard work factor and trying to figure out what it is, I think was always a common thread through those. So I like that you covered that. I think that's very important.
yeah, I think to sum it up, there's um, this guy named I forget his first name. Last name is Musakia. The brains behind the Muzzy Broadhead, and he had a line that said something like, "The harder you work, the luckier you get." You
Yep.
know, I believe that. I'm sure it's not an original thought to him, but he's the person I heard voice that, and I really kind of instantly grabbed it because I thought that's kind of sums up my approach. Because you do recognize these unique talents around you, and that you've read about, whatever it might be. One of my little lines I've often used to my staff at Deer and Deer Hunting magazine was that you can't all be Mozart. You know, you know, there's only one Mozart, and
Hmm.
find our find our niche out there and be our best at what we do. And yeah, we aren't going to be famous 100 years from now. But the thing I'll also say is that I'm 68. Mozart was dead at age 37. So, I'm. I think, well, I got that going for me.
So maybe that is so true. I love that. It's a good perspective on those things too. And that this is something that I kind of switching gears, but it just popped into my mind because it was something that I remembered I really wanted to ask you about your trip to Normandy this year. And I had interviewed Jack Carr. He had just come off of that being there. I think it's the Best Defense Foundation who flew out. I think it was like the 102 different veterans that were almost 102 years old each, right? And kind of that big grand 80th anniversary and the marking of that experience. And so we talked about that a little bit, but I wanted to know what was it that you been there before to the beaches of Normandy? What made you decide that, hey, I'm going to go, and what was that experience like for you? I know it's not, it's kind of out of left field here, but it's something that I wanted to make sure we covered it because I felt like that was such a profound, honoring of our really our heroes. And so I wanted to, know your perspective, obviously, spending time in the Navy and what that was like for you personally.
It was, about a year ago, I got the idea that, I'm not getting any younger. And I've read a lot about D-Day over the years. And my main fascination with military stuff though is through the Navy, and therefore I've always been even more fascinated by Guadalcanal, the big battles of the Pacific, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these horrible battles the Marines and sailors fought in the Pacific. But I also knew that the Navy played a huge role in Normandy, and so I always had that interest. And I just plus I always have this abiding respect for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is part of the Navy. They don't often like to acknowledge that, but they make jokes about it. When I was in the Navy, one of the things I used to take a little, I'd be a little bit embarrassed by it, but when we used to have Marines come on board our ship for various time periods, and the Marines were always these cut, chiseled guys who were really in shape, and sailors tended not to quite be that way. But anyway, to get back on track, so when I started thinking about Normandy, I thought, I've read a lot about World War II in Europe and in the Pacific, and I thought, D-Day, that's emotional stuff. Just the heroism, the idea of these guys coming ashore and just many of them just being wiped out within seconds, And I think we've all seen movie Saving Private Ryan. And I think even before Saving Private Ryan, I remember being moved reading about Normandy and what happened there. And then these just chilling things about these guys landing behind the enemy lines in the dark, parachuting in, the 82nd Airborne, and then that push across Europe and culminating at the whole thing with Patton's big march across there to pull things out at the Battle of the Bulge. All these kind of things always kind of give me the goosebumps. Well, to kind of build up to that a little bit too is my daughter Leah, when she was stationed, and she went in the Navy. She spent 14 years in the Navy as a Navy nurse and a midwife. And when she was stationed in Italy for 3 years back, about 10, 15 years ago, we visited the American cemetery up at Anzio in Italy. Horrible battles there with the Germans as you pushed the Germans out of Italy. And then we also, a couple of years later, in 2013, visited the American cemetery up at Florence, Italy. And it really, I have a late friend of mine, used to say that no American visiting Europe should be allowed to do anything fun in Europe until they visit an American cemetery. Because I get emotional about thinking about all these thousands upon thousands of our soldiers and Marines and sailors that died in Europe in World War I, World War II. And it's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And I started thinking, well, the guys who are left from Normandy, they're like you mentioned, but 100 left now. The survivors that they're dying they've been dying for years. One of my first personal accounts as far as the war in Europe was interviewing guys back in my newspaper days. I'd go to these veteran picnics. They were like anniversaries of D-Day. They'd have like local gatherings of guys who had served in Europe. And I remember going to this one picnic and interviewing these guys who are now long gone, who were then the age I'm at now, and interviewing them, and they're recounting their stories in Europe. So that kind of stuff always resonated with me. And so the idea of going to Normandy, I started thinking, if I don't go there soon, I might not ever get there. You can't take anything for granted once you're in your 60s, I think.
Yeah.
And so, the way it turned out, my wife had a former coworker who settled in France a few years ago, and she volunteered to be our guide, basically. So we weren't able to visit Normandy on the anniversary day itself because all the dignitaries were up there.
Right.
Leaders from Biden to I think all like France's president, all these different people, and plus the remaining veterans and Tom Hanks, all those Spielberg, all those folks were up there on D-Day itself. But then we went up there the next couple of days and the day before, and drove around, stopped in. I got to meet some young guys in the army who were stationed in Italy, who were over at Normandy for the. I think they were taking part in a parachute drop like a couple of days later.
Yeah.
All these different sites around Normandy, all the little villages that American troops fought through. And it's cool too, just to walk along the beaches and look up into these draws and see some of the old pillboxes and stuff still sitting there. They're not intact, but there's still remnants of them. And just thinking about how many people came ashore and how many landing craft hit these beaches, how many ships were out there pushing these people out. And then just the terrible stuff that took place there. Guys, if you ever want to read some great accounts of that Ernie Pyle, this great reporter who wrote daily accounts of the fighting. And what's interesting to me when I read these accounts by Ernie Pyle and a guy named Richard Tregaskis, he covered the Guadalcanal as a newspaper guy. One thing that strikes me is how much more graphic our reporting has become over time, like through Vietnam and into the current times. Where back in World War II, their accounts were really compelling. They weren't that graphic. They weren't really laying out just really how awful some of these scenes were. I mean, they described them, but in more a little bit sanitized version. And I didn't really realize when I was a kid reading Richard Tregaskis' account of Guadalcanal Diary, really how awful and brutal Guadalcanal's fighting was. And then later in life, realizing that as bad as it was on shore, the Navy suffered even greater losses in battles around Guadalcanal, in the waters around Guadalcanal. And so all those kind of things that kind of come into focus for you, and you realize, well, it's much harder to go see what's left of Guadalcanal and the fighting that took place in the Pacific. But D-Day is not only more famous, but also more accessible. And so that's what we ended up doing. We walked around quite a bit at Omaha Beach, and also when we drove around, you got to go around this kind of a marshy area and get back around to where Utah Beach is.
Mm-hmm.
And at Utah Beach, they have a Navy memorial there. That's kind of cool. So anyway, but then too, you read about those two beaches and the fighting that took place. You start realizing that the guys that landed at Omaha Beach was just horrible compared to what went on at Utah Beach. I mean, it was still vital to the victory, but the toll and human loss was just horrible at Omaha Beach. And I became aware by walking around the cemetery there on June 7th. We were walking around in the morning at June 7th at the cemetery there that overlooks Omaha Beach, and I just stumbled onto a couple of different grave sites where they had these little medallions on top of the marble cross. One of them was about the Bedford Boys. And I had never heard of the Bedford Boys, or if I had, it had been in and out of my consciousness. But the Bedford Boys was a National Guard unit from Bedford, Virginia. And I think I might be getting the numbers wrong a little bit, but 22 of them landed in this National Guard unit on D-Day at Omaha Beach, and only 6 survived the day. Most of them were wiped out within seconds of the landing craft dropping its gate and then busting out and being machine gunned. And it's just horrible to read about. It's a little town of Virginia, Western Virginia, up by Stanton, and not Stanton, but by Roanoke in that region. That shit, these guys were. You talk about men that there's a good book out there on it that was written about 20 years ago, before a lot of the family members were all gone, whatever. But it made me come home and get that book and read about the Bedford Boys. And then I always think it's fun how as we learn about stuff, we realize you can never stop learning. It's just a matter of, sometimes you got to jump off and read other stuff too. But, you can read, and you can spend the rest of your life reading books about D-Day and
Yeah.
never, and just, we did a good job recording that history, but still it'll always be for ourselves personally, always incomplete. So I guess that's my effort by going there. I think it was kind of just a better appreciation of what this was all about. And I was thinking it still would have been fun if I would have put a little more thought into it, to start walking those beaches where the British and Canadians came on at Sword and I forget the name of it, Sword and Gold beaches, and then walk all the way up and go all the way around all the way to Utah Beach, and just get an idea of how much planning, manpower, and ships and everything else it took to pull this thing off to where we won. And really, it's no exaggeration to think how different the world might be right now if America hadn't done what we did back then.
What is
So
it? What was it like for when you're there, and what were the locals? How did they treat all the Americans coming back, and any other other countries who have people who maybe come in to kind of commemorate these moments and give honor and respect where due? What was that like in that kind of sense?
great question, George, because one of the fun things when we got there on June 5th and started doing our touring around there, we met some of these reenactors, guys dressed up in the World War II uniforms of the U.S. Soldiers. And the first group I saw these guys gathering, I walked over and just said hello, and they're all young guys. They're probably like in their 30s, a little bit older than typical soldier of that era, of the World War II era, but still young enough to look the part compared to me. Was twice their age, and but they were from Spain. They were young guys from Spain who wanted to come down to over to Normandy. They actually came north to Normandy from Spain, but they wanted to take part in this and be part of the reenactments and hang out in these because they have all these little places set up where they're reenacting the soldiers and how they camped, how they organized, and they had all the old jeeps, and they had like little parades going through. I think in St. Mary Iglesia, where this famous scene in the movie about D-Day, the longest day.
Mm-hmm.
This famous scene where this American paratrooper gets hung up in the steeple of a church and plays dead until the Germans cut him down. And he has to let them know he's alive, and they captured him. But then when the Americans came in, they got him, rescued him. But all those kind of stories you see it in real life. Here's that guy. They still have a dummy hanging there in that church steeple. You got the parachute up on top, and the dummy hanging down below about where he would have been hanging in his death. So the Germans didn't shoot him, because a lot of those paratroopers that landed off site landed in the middle of the German troops. They were mowed down before they even got hit the ground. They were dead, shot already. But to get back to your point, one thing I really wanted to stress was, um, you often hear in our country people saying things like, "Oh, the French, they don't appreciate what we did," and that kind of stuff, and kind of sometimes actually making fun of the French, that they weren't courageous, they didn't fight for their own country. Actually, a lot of French people, a lot of the French citizens died long before we were involved, and many more thousands were killed after we got involved by fighting for the resistance. And I have to say that we spent 4 days in Paris, and then another 10 days touring France and Normandy and other World War II sites that I wanted to visit, including um, the American grave site at Belleau Wood, where the Marine Corps drove back drove back to Germans in World War One. And the French people were very nice to us everywhere we went, and we couldn't. My wife and I can't speak French. It's kind of embarrassing how bad we are about not taking up some better French lessons before we went there. But we just basically had to throw ourselves on their mercy and hope they could help us out. And whether we're in Paris or elsewhere in the country, the French treated us very well, very, very respectfully. It might be too because we're older, and they just kind of feel sorry for. I mean, I think when you're older, you tend to get treated differently than you did when you're younger. And I just find that not only in France, but I think in our own country, I just find that there's just a lot less screwing around. I find I go out and about these days, and there's a certain amount of respect you gain by just getting older.
Hmm.
So I have to say that we were treated very nicely and very helpfully. I mean, people would come up to us and offer help. Like I were on the subway, we were looking around and kind of confused about which way to go to get to the next train, and some guy walked over with barely really minimal English skills, but was able to help us out, realizing where do we want to go, and follow him, and off we went. So it was like that quite often, though.
Oh, that's great. Well, I just can't imagine what that would be like to go and, be on that hallowed ground, and especially right around that, time of anniversary. I know my family and I are about to take a trip. By the time this airs, we'll already be back, so I'll probably have already shared some stuff. But we're going to go to Fredericksburg, Texas, and that is where they have the National Pacific War Museum and some memorial, a lot of different vehicles and different things going on. And I have a personal history there. My grandfather was a colonel in the Air Force and was in the CIA, DIA, had a bunch of different work that he did all around the world, and spent a lot of time in Paris and then Finland, and around those eras in time, and kind of in the reconstruction of sorts too. So there's so much to, like, he was he was the last off of the Bataan Islands as the Japanese came in and took over. He was actually there as MacArthur's wingman. He and his friend were the two pilots that flew MacArthur off, who would not go at all when anybody told him. He always went on his own gut. And so they're like, "We have to go." And he's like, "Not yet." They were like, "We have to, we're going to leave you." So they were like, the stories though that he had of these, so many near misses, just being in these places and then leaving his whole company of friends, and then never, most of the time, seeing some of those guys again, or maybe in the hospital or something, and very few going through. And that generation, they didn't really, while there was time that they talked about things, I think too, like maybe there isn't, like you mentioned, like that idea of it, the reporting wasn't as graphic then. The details of which my grandfather would talk about, there'd be these brushstrokes of what he did, and then you'd look back on that time in history, like that was a very key component or place of battle or whatever it was. It was monumental of sorts in different stages of the war. And now looking back on that, just to see how that the greatest generation, they didn't share as much. There was a lot that they internalized and went through, because I don't think we can really also envision all the different types of horrors and atrocities and what it was like you mentioned too, thinking about that. The gate goes down, and 9 out of 10 people around you are gone instantly that have, and children, people who have lied about their ages to be there and serve their country. It's, man, they are the greatest generation. And so I already am trying to prepare, get well hydrated, because I know I'm just going to be teary-eyed the whole time reading about this and being in the Pacific War, museum there. Just kind of watching it, I was just, man, it's a heavy thing. So, but I think it's important for us to go and experience those heavy things and know how we got to where we are, how the world could have been different if we, weren't a part of this, winning group and changing the dynamics of history. So, what do they say? History doesn't always repeat itself, but it sure does influence it. It's like you have to. There's a fluidity of that kind of thing too. I think it's important for us to study the history. So I definitely want to kind of take the voyage you just took as well to kind of really put my boots on the ground and get a sense of that in person.
Yeah, one of my common things I share with people is I just don't think today that I don't think enough Americans really appreciate how good we have it. When I hear a lot of the complaining out there and about all the doom and gloom, it makes me, I get a little bit angry about it because I think, God, I, we people my age especially have lived in a very good time. I mean, I saw older guys just a few years older than me go off to the Vietnam War.
Hmm.
I grew up with kids who lost older brothers in Korea. So I had those kind of memories that it was just an assumption when I was a little kid, it was an assumption that you would one day end up in the military. Just the way the world was.
Right.
And as a little kid, having discussions with my older brother, and not with my younger brother. I think it changed that fast. But I remember discussions with my older brother and his friends about which branch of the military you would one day serve in. And I actually had developed thoughts as a little kid that I wanted to be in the Navy because the idea of being in an airplane and plummeting out of the sky just terrified me. Just for whatever reason, it really terrified me. And the idea of sitting in a trench and fighting a ground war, that didn't seem very appealing either. But for some reason, the Navy always appealed to me. I think it's because I remember as a little boy too reading about John F. Kennedy and his time in the Navy. PT 109 was a story that every little boy in my era knew the story of PT 109 and that crew surviving getting cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. As part of your story as a kid. You just knew these things. And then by the time I get out of high school, that was fading. The Vietnam experience was a horrible thing for a country to go through. And I still believe though in the idea of public service and something that I think is important. And I often say the Navy for me was a real formative part of my life. I have a tattoo on my left leg about how it basically created the life I have now. Because I think if I hadn't gone to the Navy, all these little things that fall into place in life for us. And one of the things that fell into place for me was when I was in the Navy, the ship I was on went in the dry dock in 1978 for a year. So I took that time to take a night class. In that night class, I met my wife. Later on, we got married, had three little girls that were now adults. But I think if all those things hadn't worked out the way they did, I never would have met this girl from New Jersey. I was from Wisconsin. I wouldn't have had the three daughters we have now. All these things that play out in life that there was no guiding force that I was following. I just was kind of taking good opportunities as they arose and capitalizing on them. But and then next thing you know, you have a whole life behind you, and you think, well, it would have been a lot different if I would have stayed home, and I would have never had these exposures to people on the ship. Living with other people on the ship who came from all walks of life, literally. Guys from the ghettos of Baltimore, the ghettos of Chicago, and just them serving on a ship, and they're now your shipmates, and you want to get along with people. And it's one thing. My dad had this theory, George. I think you'll appreciate. I grew up in a house where I shared a bedroom with three brothers, and my two sisters shared a bedroom. And my dad would say later in life, he thinks it's one of the reasons we, as a society, have gotten so contentious with each other is that we haven't learned to live together. He said, look, kids today each have their own room. A lot of times they have their own computer, their own TV. They live in these little isolated blocks. And I've often thought, without realizing it, by growing up in a room with three brothers and learning how to, function in that environment was good preparation for boot camp. Is good preparation for living in a ship where you're sharing a room, a berthing quarters with, in my case, 180 guys in this big berthing part of the ship I was on. I was on a big destroyer tender. It's a 650-foot long ship, and we were basically a repair ship. We'd pull into port, and other Navy ships like destroyers and cruisers would pull up alongside, and frigates. We go work on those ships, and but you learn, you may not like someone, but you sure as hell better learn to get along with them when you got those duties to perform. And that's where I think the military, if nothing else, it teaches you a lot about human relationships and how to get along with people, and realizing every day that a guy who grew up in Queens, New York, Phil Bonilla was his name, but he was a Puerto Rican, and he used to always tease me about how unprepared I was for life on the street. Because he grew up on the streets, New York and in that region, and it was a rough life compared to the life I'd grown up in. I was pretty naive compared to him. And so he'd go on. When we walked over and worked on our ships, he was always pointing out stuff to me on the way back about certain guys he saw on their ships. Watch out for that guy, that kind of stuff. That guy, don't mouth off to him. You might outrank him, but don't mouth off to him because he has no respect for rank. And Phil would make these judgments on the spot. And I learned, to respect that. And likewise, after I got married and spent time 20 some years around my wife, one thing I learned to respect about my wife is that if we had that difference of opinion about someone in our world, whether it's a coworker, whatever it might be, I learned over time to respect her view, that her read on that person more often than mine turned out to be right. And I always thought that was always, for me, that was always instructive. I think I go through life as kind of a Pollyanna, always expecting the best of people. And whereas I think, Phil Bonilla and Penny, my wife, they're a little more observant, I think, about what are we actually looking at here? So I think I made my life as a reporter who has to be tuned into people, but I still realize that I'm not always as perceptive as I think I might could be, so.
Well, I think also having that idea like that, hoping that always works out too. You have a positivity and a lens of which I think that kind of gives that hope, credence, and that it kind of, because there's so many things in the world too. If people only just focus on the negative, and there's people who do all the time, we see it, right? I mean, it's all the time. And when you do that, it's very discouraging. It's not a good way to live your life, but being aware to different things too. I see it a lot of times. I grew up in Houston, and, there's certain street smarts you get from being in a major city, and things you see and pick up on that I would see with other friends they wouldn't pick up on. I'm like, yo, that right there, there's something about to go down. We need to move out of here. And like my wife and I just the other day, like we picked up on this one guy that was like, there's something ain't right now. And just being aware of our surroundings and being cued in enough. And then there's other people were walking right by, and I was like, this guy is really, he's probably high on something. There was something that he was way off. And everyone else just around, I was like, this guy doesn't seem right. And he's like calling out people and what they're wearing. I don't like that. I don't like that. And I'm like, here he's talking to himself. I'm like, okay, we're going to go ahead and head on out across the parking lot, go to the other store. And, it was something just to be aware of. But I think, focus. I think I want to focus back on what you said too about that idea of like, having, growing up with brothers and sisters, and you kind of have this forced reconciliation of sorts of like how you're going to work well with others. And it is true. I think there is something to say about that isolationism of having your own room, your own thing. That's kind of new. Before, growing up with my parents and beyond there, every kid stepped in the same room, and there's sometimes bigger families, and whatever it was, that there was a way that you had to learn to get along a little better. And I think it's important that we kind of have to do that these days and really accept each other and our neighbors, whether we have the same opinions or different opinions, just being able to respect it, right? Respect that people have their own. When you were talking about kind of your journey and, obviously through our whole conversation, it got me thinking a lot about something that I ask all my guests, and that's about this idea of legacy. And I'm curious about yours, and how you view your legacy. And you can approach this however you want. It doesn't, like, how do you hope to be remembered when you're gone? Like, what is it that you think about? Do you think about that on a daily basis, or, at a weekly, monthly, whatever it may be, on your contributions from your work side of things? And then obviously you have a big family and like your family side of things. So I was just kind of curious, is that something you think about? And if so, how do you approach that idea of legacy in that personal and professional setting?
I think my work legacy, I think I'll have no control over it. How it, I really don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about that. I figure it'll take care of itself. And I remember there's a great book written back in I think probably the late '70s, early '80s. It was written by Ben Bradley, this former Washington Post editor, real famous editor of the Washington Post. But he had for a brief time a real close rapport with President Kennedy. And someplace in that book, he said that Kennedy once told him that once you're gone, who the hell cares? As far as you know what people are writing about you and saying about you. And I think that's kind of the way and I think too, it's just a recognition that we can't control it.
Hmm.
And so I figure it kind of goes back to my thoughts earlier that while we're here, while we're working, you give it your best shot. You put it out there, and you can back it up, and you just try to always achieve that level of effort every day in your work. And then there's kind of trusting that if it remains relevant in people's lives, they'll find it. I think it's easier to find stuff now than it's ever been. I
Sure.
can find examples, George, in my daily life almost, where I hear someone saying something, and I'll think, you probably read that on the MeatEater website at some point in your life in recent years, because I don't think you would have gotten that particular little nugget somewhere else. But you just have to realize, and I think this is where newspapers were great training, is that you realize real quickly at newspapers and magazines that most people do not read bylines. They read headlines, and if they get past the headline, they read the article, but they seldom go back and see who actually wrote it, unless you pissed them off or something. Then they'll go back and say, "Well, no, who the hell wrote this?"
We got to
And
get a button and some signs. Yeah.
so, you think. I just hope that of course, I hope my stuff isn't forgotten when I'm gone. I'm hoping there's occasionally a Google search that will turn up something I wrote, for a newspaper or Steve's MeatEater website or American Hunter magazine, whatever it might be. Because most of the stuff does get online and lives there for a long time
Mhm.
now. And so I hope somebody will find some use in this stuff. But what's always humbling about working in this space, though, is that no matter how famous you think you might be, or how I just kind of assume that most people haven't read my stuff, or if they read my stuff, they don't recognize that I was the one behind it. I meet people regularly. You stop by the house, and all of a sudden they'll go, "Oh, I see your MeatEater sticker in your truck. You like MeatEater?" I said, "Yeah." We'll get talk, and then I'll tell them, "Well, I actually do a little work with those guys," and they're shocked, and then "Wow, I didn't know that." And because you realize I don't. One of my little memories I have, George, that always keeps me grounded, was the first time I ever saw something of mine in print was at a college newspaper back in 1982, spring of 1982. Had my first article ever printed in a publication. And he asked us the college newspaper. It was the first time for me I'd ever seen my name in a byline. This is big stuff, I felt,
Yeah.
and but then when I went to work at the newspaper, when you, our newspaper office and that college newspaper was down this little basement, and we all didn't have keys for that door that came in the back side of that building. So what we do is take a newspaper and just shove it into the door so that the latch couldn't close behind you. Now I always remember one day after my column came out, or article, whatever it was, I remember opening that door, pulling the newspaper out, and there, punched perfectly through my little byline. My byline was this door latch. It's punching through it, and newspapers, was always, they always kept you humble, because people always say you use newspapers once you've read them, to line your bird cage, to put in the dog kennel, to wrap fish, all those things that kind of are this the utilitarian side of a newspaper, which we no longer have in many cases.
Right.
But that was always, I think, a good way to stay grounded. That, yeah, you might think you're pretty hot stuff because you had a article in the newspaper, but um, fame is fleeting. You know,
Well, that it's so true. I think you remember that first time that you get your name in print, and I kind of look at certain things like that where it's almost like having a short memory. Like I coach soccer, and let's say a kid goes to wide open goal and hits the ball, goes over the goal, goes to the side of the goal, whatever. Or a goalkeeper goes to catch the ball, goes right through their hands, or whatever sport it can be. And I always tell those kids too, I'm like, listen, acknowledge it, but you have to have a short memory, because now that's happened, it's done. It's finished. You can learn from it. You got to live with it, because you can't go back and change that. And I think too, when you ever do something too, I look at when I got my first article that was published on the MeatEater website, and it's funny too. I turned it in with, like, I think it was like a 4,000 word article. They go, no, 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 no. The only people who can have an article of that size is Steve or Pat, and that's it. No one else gets the big ones. I started laughing. So I'm cutting it down and everything, and I get it on there, and I was like, wow, that's so cool. It's like I was really excited to do that. But then almost within 2 days, it's kind of a distant memory in that sense, because also you spent so much time working on this article. It's from an experience from the year before, and it's like, okay, moving on. What am I doing now? Because I don't, yeah, that's a cool thing. It's a neat feather in your cap. I was published here, whatever it is, and like you said too, it's like you can turn around in one moment, and that's, being used for the kennel floor, whatever it is. It's like it's done. And I think a lot of times you just got to keep, pushing forward to that next experience in life, and whatever that may be, because those things we do are, great triumphs. That doesn't mean anything the next day, right? So I always kind of try to keep myself humble with those things too. It's like, okay, that's happened, but when I put out a podcast, I'm like, okay, cool, I'll promote that thing, but then I'm like, okay, that one's done. What can I do next? And I'm always trying to get to that next thing, write that next article, produce that next show, whatever it is. And I think it's fun because having that short memory works in that professional setting, not just on the play field. I know that I've read tons of your articles. I've gone to your website. You put out so much. There's so much on the MeatEater. For those people who want to follow and check out some of your articles, can you go ahead and give your website and some of your social handles that people can do before we kind of sign off? I want to make sure that people do that, and I'll have all those in the show notes before, but after the show. But I want to make sure that you get a chance to plug those as well.
yeah, my website is Patrick Durkin Outdoors, all one word, patrickdurkinoutdoors.com. On there, I always post my weekly newspaper column, and if people want to get little reminders every time I post my weekly column, they can become site members, and then I just add them to my email distribution list. So I send out the link down every week. I also let's see, MeatEater. I was pretty regular with them, every 2 weeks for a long time. I've kind of, as I've gotten older here, I'm not. One thing I find that's interesting, George, as I've gotten older, is that I don't process information as fast as I used to. I used to be able to really pour through interviews and reading stuff and crank out an article and then be on the next one just right away. And I'm finding it's kind of like my running. I've been running since I was 51. And I've realized that I've been documenting my decline because, with these running apps, they'll tell you how fast you're running, how far you ran, all that kind of stuff. And then it's kind of cool. But then after you've done it for a few years, you start realizing that cool app is documenting your decline for you. And so I had this nice little peak for a long time where I was getting faster and faster. And then at about age 57, I didn't realize at the time, but I had peaked. It's been downhill ever since. And I look at my work and I hope my quality, the finished product is still there. And I'm finding I'm just not getting it out there as much as I used to. And it's kind of frustrating because I think, well, I'm 68, so I suppose it's inevitable that this will happen. But until Maggie and Steve or whoever else is looking at my stuff tells me, hey, maybe it's time to, maybe your time has come. Because I think, because we all know that's kind of the inevitable facts of life, that we all have our day and at some point it goes. But to get back to your question, though, I'm also on Instagram, and that's just at Patrick Durkin Outdoors, and Facebook, and I'm pretty easy to find. If you just Google my name and outdoors, you'll find my website, and also my MeatEater stuff. And MeatEater does a good job. One thing I do with people quite often is that they'll ask about where can I read your stuff, and MeatEater has a queue of just my stuff.
Yeah.
If you Google my name and you see my little profile thing and hit that, everything I've written for MeatEater, which is over 100 and I think I'm over like 120 now with total submissions to them, probably more than that. It's all there. And in fact, I'm already at a point in my career where I've forgotten half the stuff I've written. I go back and I'll go, oh yeah, I
That
wrote
was
that.
good. Yeah.
There's oftentimes, George, I call something up of mine. I'll read the lead and go, what the hell? I wrote that, and God, it must have made sense in the moment, because that's one thing that's always fun about writing is that you don't really realize until you're a few years down the road that how much in the moment we live. And
Mm-hmm.
so a lead in the article, it makes so much sense in the moment, makes virtually no sense 5 years from now. All the context that goes into our daily thoughts and stuff, and it's just I think it's kind of a fun thing to experience too, where it's finish a little thought there about how it's just also ephemeral, just it's here and gone. I remember one of my early lessons when I actually was working full time. This is back at the Oshkosh Northwestern days in the 1980s, where you showed up for work with a tie on every day. I remember one time writing an article, and this is the days before the modern era of you press a button, the newspaper page would roll out in the back room. Well, they used to do it where the headlines would print out on a piece of paper, and the text would print on another piece of wax paper, and they go over to this big blue sheet and start laying the strips down with the X-Acto knives, cutting off and then wrapping the leg to the next column. I always remember I had this one article I'd written, a front page article, and when I came to the jump page, it jumped inside the paper. It overlapped an advertisement by about maybe 6 lines of type that were hanging over the advertisement. I always remember this woman in the back shop. Her name is Janet Grable. She's the one that did a lot of paste up work, the X-Acto knife and rulers and stuff. And I remember her laying that type down, and a little ruler underneath it, taking an X-Acto knife and just slicing it. And then she handed me those final 6 lines of newspaper text, or of wax paper with my lines on it. And she says, "Here, Durkin, read this. No one else will." Ha ha ha. And that's the brutality of newspaper work, that it's if you overwrite, if you go beyond what they've laid that article out for you, they just whack it at the final part that fits. And that was the reality of your daily life. So you learned to write tightly, and make it punchy and just cut out excessive words. And I like quoting this thought from John Prine, this great songwriter. He says something to the effect that the essence of songwriting was that you remove everything that doesn't belong, and then what's left, that's your song. And I think the good songwriters, the good writers, period, all understand that principle, that you only put in what's necessary. You don't put all the extra words. You chop all that excess out, and you just get down to like good. I think that's why poetry is so hard, and why I don't do it. Is that poetry is really, just really buttoned down tight, and
Yeah.
think about what they're actually saying because it's so tight. Whereas, I just don't have the talent for that kind of writing. So I plus it doesn't pay. So,
Well, I got to study under a guy named Harvey Arden, who was a National Geographic staff writer for 20, I think 5 years, put out a bunch of books, kind of working when I used to travel with indigenous elders around the world and put together life stories and messages. And I remember I would write articles, or we were working on one of our books, and I'd hand it over to him, and he'd hand back something, and I'm like, "There's no words left." He's like, "Yes, it's too much. You need to cut down." I was like, "There's literally one sentence." He's like, "And it was a good one. The other 20 or whatever, they had to get out of there." So it taught me, before I thought, "Oh, I have to go and expand all these things." He's like, "People don't have the attention for that a lot of times. And if you're going to be published, sometimes they're going to give you this much space. You got to have all those things." Because he used to do like captions for like encyclopedias and things. He's like, "I had to learn to use this many words, and like but it really helped teach me about kind of trying to condense. I'm still not good at it. I'm way too verbose. I can talk and write forever. But when I go through, and after kind of throwing everything on the page and then reading back later on, and okay, I can cut this, I can cut this. That's not important. It's really, that was a valuable tool to have somebody help me to then be able to edit my own writing. And I think for anybody who, and there may be a lot of listeners and viewers of this that are, wondering about outdoor writing, obviously with your career of it too. I think that's something to write some more, but then also learn about editing tools and kind of how you can kind of chop out the things that maybe aren't, the extras, and really get down to those points. Cause that's really important stuff too. I agree with you on all that.
as an outdoor writer, you always have a certain chip on your shoulder and insecurities, because I think a lot of people don't take it seriously. I think there's, in my career, I can look at some of the what I thought were the great outdoor writers and newspapers that I grew up reading, and then later in life learned about, who died basically the year I was born. There was a guy named Gordon McCrory, who was the longtime Milwaukee Journal outdoor editor. He wrote the Milwaukee Journal for about 20 some years. I think they hired him like in 1933 away from a newspaper up in Superior, Wisconsin. And then he died of a heart attack at age 56 in 1956. He's just a relatively young guy when he died. But I think, the year I was born, McCrory died. Well, I'm here on these days. I find these books that a guy I know here in Wisconsin has compiled a lot of these great Gordon McCrory stories and stuff that he wrote for Sports Afield and the Milwaukee Journal back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And you realize, there's a lot of gifted outdoor writers out there, and that some of them have never gotten famous. But damn, the fact that we're still reading Gordon McCrory, at least a few of us, nearly 70 years after he died, I think that's pretty cool. And I every time I get a chance to turn people on to Gordon McCrory, I do it because I think doesn't matter where you live in this country, you can read his stuff and just go back in time and realize what a cool way he had of writing. And another guy that came to the Milwaukee Journal was Jay Reed, who I grew up reading, and I got to meet him late in his life, and I always lusted after his job. And I told him that, and he's mad. I still want your job, Jay. And I never got it, and the way things go. I think twice yeah, 2 or 3 times I applied for that job down there in Milwaukee. Just the way it turned out, they never hired me. And I always think, well, there's a blessing and curse in that. I wish I'd gotten that job, but I can't complain about the way my career unfolded. So plus I think, God, if you sit there and spend a whole lot of time with living with your regrets, man, it's hard to get ahead. It's hard to stay ahead when you're always obsessing about things you didn't get, and just, geez.
It reminded me of a quote. And I think I read it in a book, said if you got 1 foot in yesterday and 1 foot in tomorrow, you're pissing all over today. And there's that it's crude, but it was something true. You have to be aware of your present stuff. Can't hang your hat on all the laurels because there's only so many hat hooks, and then you can't look at all your regrets because those are in the past. You got to have that short memory, and whatever it is in that sense. One last question before we head out, and I think we're gonna have to do a continuation because I'm having way too good of a time chatting with you, and there's a lot of things we hadn't got to cover that I really want to. But that said, all your writing, obviously there's a lot of things that are categorized online now. There's things people can search, but I'm curious, do you have any interest in putting out a book? Is there a desire of you to, whether it's a culmination of your career and kind of maybe series of things that you've written before that it's pieced together, or kind of your journaling of your own time, something you leave behind for your family to just kind of chronicle through your thoughts in your lifetime? Like, is that something that is ever appealed to you? And if so, is that something you think you'll do, or is it something I thought about it, but I'm not going to? So I'm just curious about that.
Thanks for asking. I've never done a book where I've actually I basically ghost wrote a book for a deer hunting outfitter named Tom Enderbo up here in Buffalo County, Wisconsin. My name's on the book, but basically, like, I think it says something like by Tom Enderbo with Pat Durkin or something like that. And,
Mhm.
and I basically interviewed Tom extensively. I'd write a chapter for him. He'd look it over, make a few suggestions, and I'd polish it off. But it's basically his book. And so I wrote it for him. That's the only complete book I've ever written. But it's not something that really has nothing to do with me. So it's just basically just a reporting job on for
Mhm.
Tom. Um, I've done some books where I've compiled like the best of type things up for like Deer and Deer Hunting magazine, where I included a few of my articles, but mainly the bulk of it was other articles. And when people ask me over the years, have you done a book? I often said, and I still say, no, because I like getting paid each week. I like the weekly paychecks and the biweekly paychecks, whatever it might be, because I'll never apologize for being kind of a mercenary about my writing. I've always respected the idea that if you want to make a career out of this, you can't do it for free.
Mhm.
Uh, Speaking of when I talk about quotations, one that I quote a lot there's this great English writer back in the 1700s during the time of the American Revolution named Samuel Johnston. Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson had this great quote about no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. And I keep that pinned to my desk here because it sums it up in just a real tight thought that only an idiot writes for free. And I tell people that quite often. Like, what I find kind of fun these days that I get inquiries every now and then from various websites for asking if I'll write for them. And so my first question is, well, what's your rate? What do you pay? And someone will say, I'm not sure what you're talking about. I say, well, I don't write for free. I'm making a living at this. And because I think, if you write for a hobby, fine, but you know, it has to make money if you want to stay at it. And I think a lot of people on social media will find that out over the years now. I mean, that they're having fun cranking out videos, and there might be for their websites, but at some point, if it's not putting diapers on your kids or putting food in your refrigerator, it won't last. And I think that's just the harsh reality of writing and content creating, whatever you want to call it. It comes down to the same thing, that it's got to pay the bills. It can't just be for fun, unless you're independently wealthy, and which I'm not, and never will be. And I always think though that I look at my work and how many hours I put into stuff over the years, and I don't sit around questioning my effort. I don't have regrets about it. Oh, I wish I don't think when I'm up on the deathbed, if that's how I go, I don't think I'll ever say I wish I'd spent more time hunting or fishing, or I spent more time with my kids. I like to think that my kids grew up understanding that if their dad wasn't such a hard worker, they wouldn't have had the lives they've had. And they wouldn't have had the opportunity to go to college and have and come out of college without any debt. My wife and I worked. We put them through college. Our one daughter who went into the Navy, she went through on ROTC. But I like to think my kids respect the fact that I was there, but I wasn't always around them every hour of the day and trying to be the perfect dad. I am who I am, and I think I like to think though, George, that bottom line, they knew I gave a damn. They knew I cared. They knew I loved them. And I think beyond that, I don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about where things go after I'm gone. I figure, well, it'll take care of itself. It'll work out. And I have, but the one thing I thought about as far as after I'm gone is my only thought was, well, I still have to fill out the paperwork so that when I'm gone, the Navy can take my ashes and bury them at sea. And I prefer to be buried in the casket, a real Navy burial.
Mm-hmm.
I was described, watching these scenes in World War II where on the USS Intrepid, for example, they had a big ceremony of all these guys, all these bodies in these body bags, and dropped them over the side. They say a few words and left board, and they were sliding off. And I think, well, if I could do it that way, that's how I want to be buried. But the Navy doesn't bury you on your schedule; they bury you at sea on their schedule. So most guys get buried at sea now. For the Navy, it's the ashes because it's easier to take care of an urn than a whole casket, the body inside. So that's where my morbid thoughts go some days.
Well, we'll hope that is many, many decades down the road, and that we have many more of your articles and enjoyment and great conversations throughout this time. And so I really look forward to touching base again and having you on again if you'd like to join. I really enjoyed our discussion today.
We could talk to sometime about why I respect the Texas sayings. I have you mentioned the crude one you came up with a couple minutes ago. I think Lyndon Baines Johnson had a lot of great sayings that were pretty damn crude, but I think, man, that guy was sharp. There's something about Southern thinking in Texas across the United States. I think they have a neat way of expressing themselves, and I don't think we get as many of those pithy sayings in the North. I'm not sure why that is, but the South has its share of people who can set these great quotations. I have a friend over in Alabama that I quote quite often. These great lines about work and just treating people right and all those kind of things. And the one LBJ quote that I often laugh about is he talked about one of his colleagues and why he puts up with him. And his line was something like, "It's better to have him on the inside of the tent pissing out than the outside of the tent pissing in. You keep him around."
That's a good one. There's so many colloquialisms and sayings down here. I had a buddy, Bob Leard, one time. He always say, "Man, that guy's meaner than an acre of rattlesnakes." And just There's so many good ones. And you mentioned LBJ. Actually, part of our trip to Fredericksburg is we're going to go to the LBJ Ranch and the state and national park there too, which is always free, which I learned, which is pretty cool. But that's part of it. We're going to go and see. I think they called it Air Force 0.5. It was the plane that he would fly. It was smaller, but it was whenever he was on it, it was Air Force One, right? But we're going to go in and traipse through that little bit of history too. I've been through the parks there before. It's amazing, but we're going to try to do a little bit more tour of the ranch. They shut down the Texas White House. They're doing renovations for the next year, so I'll have to do that down in the future. But I'm looking forward to that. Well, hey, Pat, once again, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with you. I look forward to having you on again. And everyone, make sure you go check out the notes below and follow your journey. Check out some of this amazing man's writings, and make sure to go over to themeateater.com. Search for Patrick Durkin there. You'll see all the articles there too. So a lot to read up on, and hope everyone's enjoyed the podcast. And once again, thank you so much for joining me.
You, George. I really appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk soon, man. You have a good one.